Thank you for joining me today on the Bold Lines podcast. We are going to be talking about the 4 responses to stress. This is a topic some people have probably heard before. I know pop psychology picked this one up a long time ago, and if anybody's ever taken an intro to psych class, this is definitely in there. Most people have only heard of 3. I add a 4th one in there, and I think it can add some good context for us. So, what are the 3 responses to stress that most people know? It's fight, flight, and freeze. I add on the end fawn. From these 4 categories, we can start to parse out which responses go where. We can get a better idea of why people are responding the way that they are. Let me clarify here. These 4 responses are only relevant when someone is pushed, not when they're just slightly concerned. If someone is answering a question objectively, that's not a stress response. But if someone feels as if their emotional or physical safety is at risk, these responses would be relevant. Something interesting to know. When we feel as if our relationships, our emotional safety nets are at risk, there's some evidence to show that our brain responds in the same way as if we were at risk of physical harm. So throughout this podcast, I'm going to be using a couple different scenarios, a physical risk and an emotional one, to give you some insight into how all of these work and what they do. I will say some people lead with a small emotion first. They will throw a little bit of a buffer. Sometimes people freeze and then fight. Sometimes people fawn and then fight. What I'm mostly concerned about today is when people are really pushed, how do they respond? All 4 of these categories are all about the same in terms of usefulness. One isn't better than the other. They all serve some reasonable and good purpose. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. Over the years, as people develop coping skills, relationship dynamics, and better understandings of themselves, this response to stress, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, starts to become more ingrained into their character. Can it be changed? Yes. Usually that change isn't super drastic, but there is a change that can be involved. However, you can start to see these different responses early on in people's lives. In childhood and teenage years, you really start to see which one of these 4 people tend to lean toward. Last thing I will say, people can have different responses to stress with different categories. So when it comes to a job, somebody might tend towards one of these 4 categories. If it comes to relationships or parenting or intimate dynamics, we can all vary to some degree. What I want you to pay attention to, though, is which one of these 4 is most like you, and we'll go from there. Those 2 scenarios that I was talking about a minute ago will be used throughout the rest of this episode and will give us some context into how we respond to stress. I'll be painting 2 pictures here. You're walking in the middle of a jungle, and all of a sudden, a jaguar jumps down out of a tree and starts coming towards you. The second scenario will be a partner angrily confronting you about some indiscretion. The first category, fight. What is the usefulness of fighting? Well, if we consider when is it good to be aggressive, push back, or to force others into submission, there's a useful self-protective factor here for ourselves, for our loved ones, for the people around us. We do need to fight for what is right, for a sense of justice in the world. Fighting in those scenarios is very much a good thing. The fight response, though, the one that we see most easily in people's stress responses, is an attempt to defend ourselves by seeming big and scary. This is the engagement. If you're going to come after me, I'm going to come after you. So let's look at our two scenarios. Our jaguar jumps down out of a tree in the jungle. If someone were to engage the fight response, they decide that they're going to go at it with their bare hands or a knife. That jaguar jumps down and they're ready to go. This is an attempt of, well, I can't leave, so I'm going to lean in as hard as I possibly can. Now let's go to the relational dynamic. Your partner comes up to you with some argument or indiscretion. You feel that stress in your body. The fight response would be to argue back or to try to win the argument. This fight response is a hope that if I win, if I'm able to dominate, convince, coerce, whatever it is, then I can be safe and things will be resolved. In the most charitable sense, people fight for what they think is right because they want it to work out. In a very pessimistic sense, people fight in order to dominate others in social relationships. Again, fighting can be a great thing. It can also be very, very detrimental. If we were to look at the fight response through a psychological lens where it goes really, really badly, you can have fight stress responses through things like oppositional defiant disorder. You see this fighting response also in people who have outburst, intermittent explosive disorder, people who tend to get in arguments or quote unquote blow up over time. The second category, flight. The flight stress response is incredibly useful when it comes to danger we cannot overcome. If we feel as if something is happening in front of us or something will happen, the best idea is to get out of there. Some practical examples of this, the flight response would be an attempt to flee, to distance from a conversation, or to physically remove yourself. You can see this all the time when people get in arguments. Some person steps away or leaves the room. The hope in the flight response is to defend by creating distance. Flight is a wonderful thing if you need to protect yourself or someone else and there's nothing else to do. You can leave and preserve yourself by going away. Let's go to our jaguar. The jaguar, in the middle of the jungle, jumps down out of the tree and looks at you. The flight response would be, let's get out of here. Let's run. Let's get as far away as we possibly can. If we were to go in the interpersonal exchange, one where our partner comes to us with an indiscretion or argument, the flight response would dictate that we change the subject or that we simply walk away or go into another room. This flight response, oftentimes in relationships, is this sense that this conversation is so overwhelming, I have to leave. Sometimes that leaving is physical, sometimes it's emotional. In really, really significant pathologies, the deep parts of broken psychology, you can have flight responses in emotional disconnection or even disconnection from body. When people talk about disconnecting from themselves and having an out-of-body experience, that is a flight response. I need to distance myself from my body because of this terrible thing, and so I'm going to somehow leave here. The third category, freeze, is an attempt to stop and allow the danger to pass. A great visualization of this comes from the movie Jurassic Park. The idea, for whatever reason, is the T-Rex can't see you if you're standing still. Its vision is based on movement. Practically speaking, where we see the freeze dynamic pop up is when people feel so overwhelmed that they stop. They get real quiet. They're unable to come up with a response or they stutter. It's this idea that if I just slow down and stop, I'll be able to collect my thoughts. I'll be able to do something about it. So let's go to our jaguar and angry spouse. For the freeze response, the jaguar jumps down out of the tree in the middle of the jungle, and this person tries to be as still as possible to let it pass you and either go by or go to someone else. If you stay still enough, maybe that jaguar's attention will go elsewhere. In the relational dynamic, the freeze response will encourage the person to get silent and allow the anger to pass. This is the person that when someone comes up with a concern or they start to see a fight response in their partner, they stop talking, they get small, and they hope that if they're quiet long enough, things will go on by. Let's look at the psychopathology of freezing. Quite honestly, I can't think of really any diagnoses that are just freeze, where you stop and wait. A lot of them are around the flight response or the fighting one. We'll get to the fawn one here in a second. Not a ton of them are freeze because the freeze dynamic is waiting for it to pass, and then typically they take off. So freeze can sometimes be related to the flight. Let's go to fawn, the fourth category that people may or may not have heard of. The fawn stress response is an attempt to be small, to draw sympathy, and it's a lack of need to fight. If you want to see the fawn response in the animal kingdom, the most obvious version of this is with dogs. If one dog is showing their superiority or their dominance over another, that dog will roll on its back and show its belly, saying, "Look how small I am. You don't have to come after me." Now, do people typically do it that way? No. I haven't seen any scenarios that I can recall of a client telling me that when their partner got mad at them, they rolled over on their back. Not typically something you see. People who fawn tend to defend themselves by showing a lack of power or agency. When I was writing the notes for this podcast, there was a video that kept coming to mind, and it's of this little girl, and she's got to be somewhere around like 3 or 4. And her mom keeps asking her, "Hey, I need you to do this thing." And she looks at her and says, "No, I'm just a baby." In a very joking sense, that is what fawning is. It's this attempt to convince the other person, you should actually pity me. To our jaguar in the jungle, jumping down in front of us. The fawning response would be to cower on the ground and lay down, to show weakness and hope that the jaguar was just showing a display of power. This is actually advice for very territorial animals. Pretty sure I've even seen this when people are talking about survival around things like gorillas, those hypersocial animals, that a lot of times they make these gestures to show that they're strong and everybody else has to fawn. In a jaguar scenario, I guess there can be some usefulness in fawning if there was just an attempt to slow down and tell them to leave. Fawning makes sense. For the partner that shows up and really starts digging into you, the fawning stress response would cause someone to talk about how terrible of a person they are. My goodness, I'm just such a terrible person. I'm a terrible brother. I'm a terrible son. I'm a terrible mother. Woe is me. How dare you look down on me? I'm just so small. There's nothing in me worth fighting. In fact, you're actually quite mean for even insinuating anything at all. What does this look like in pathology in its worst sense? You can see some of this in personality disorders. They are personal dynamics around controlling relationships. Some of the obvious fawning responses come from borderline or histrionic personality disorder when they are confronted with high levels of stress, someone is accusing them of something, one of the common responses is to demean themselves or to gain sympathy from other people. If I'm such a small person, you're mean for even saying anything. An easy practical example of this is if you were to ask a student who's in college and you were to say, "Where's your assignment? You didn't turn it in." And the student responds with, "Oh my goodness, there's so much going on. I don't even know how I can make it. I completely forgot about this assignment." That's a fawn. This leaning into how weak you are, how hurt you are, how small you are, is all kinds of fawning. So we have all four of these: fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. Fighting is a way to defend yourself by seeming big and scary. In flight, we defend ourselves by creating distance. In freeze, we defend ourselves by not making any moves and remaining still. And in fawn, we defend ourselves by showing a lack of power. All of these have their usefulness. I talked about that at the beginning of the episode. What's important, if you're listening through all of this and wondering where you are and you start to identify some things, realize that these are all protective measures if left unchecked. There are good scenarios for all four of these. However, when they go outside of their usefulness, after they've served a good function in their own context, that's when I, as a therapist, start to wonder what they're even there for. Something that might be interesting for you to hear is that some people use these out of instinct. They use these responses to stress just as a natural response. However, some people will use substances, particularly the ones that affect their mood or thinking, in order to bring out these responses. What does that look like? Well, for someone who feels as if they are overworked, the world is asking so much of them. They're the working parent in which the whole world is on their shoulders and they're carrying the weight. When they get drunk, they start asking to be taken care of. When they drink, they fawn. Or let's say, for instance, there's someone who feels as if they quite didn't get the opportunity to stand up for themselves, and they drink and become combative. They use this sense of intoxication as a way to engage in the coping skill they wish they had. Now, do we need to assume that everybody's responses is related to stress, and that's just how they're coping and we don't have to accept it? Of course not. However, when these responses outrank what is reasonable and acceptable, we have to consider, what is it that people are protecting? What is it that they're looking for? In all four of these categories, there's something that people are attempting to gain. If you yourself are coming to this conclusion, I would encourage you to consider, what is it that you're trying to get out of this? What is it that you're getting out of these stress responses? Are you hoping to be cared for, vindicated, passed over? If you're in therapy or considering it, I would tell you this is something worth exploring, because I said at the beginning of this episode, these patterns tend to exist throughout people's lives. They don't just pop up when someone's in their mid-20s. If you're not in therapy and you're just considering, what do I do with this information? Again, pay attention to when things are useful and when they're not, and see if you can slow it down through deep breathing, through centering yourself, whatever it is. Are these responses overwhelming and you can't stop them, or are they just an instinct? If you are someone who's delving into deeper parts of themselves through psychoanalytic theory like I use, or some other mode of therapy, you can connect these to what you were protecting yourself with all those years ago, or what you wish you would have protected yourself with. Give a quick couple of made-up scenarios. For someone who experienced abuse in their home, they might fight all the time as a response to stress. Might pick fights everywhere they go to say that they're finally as big as they wish they were, or maybe they use a substance to make themselves feel big, or they get into some sort of coping to be big and strong enough. If we were to look at the flight response, well, that's an easy one. If someone wished they were able to leave, to get away, they might be prone to checking out or hitting the eject button. Or they might use some sort of substance or behavior as a way to escape from what's going on. Maybe you go on a getaway with a significant other as a way to escape from responsibilities. That's a flight response. In freezing, sometimes people wished that they hadn't had said something. There was a fear in the family, and if they were able to freeze and pass over, maybe they wouldn't have gotten hurt so badly. In grown-ups, this is when someone yells at us, how do we stop? Make ourselves still. It's one, again, that I said is a little harder to define because it's typically followed by something. And then the last one, fawn. Sometimes when people were young, they were small and they were so domineered that they felt as if that's all they could do. But for some, they wished that someone would take care of them, that someone would have taken the time all those years ago to care for their needs, to hold them tightly. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you got something that was useful to you or possibly someone you love. If you feel so inclined, I hope that you follow this podcast to get an episode every Tuesday. Share this episode with someone who could find some usefulness out of it. And feel free to leave a tip in the tip jar to help pay for the production of this podcast. Thank you, and have a great day.